Thank you everybody for joining in. For those who don't know me, my name's Tom Calma and I'm co-chair of the Senior Advisory Group with Professor Marcia Langton, and we're the group that oversight the two co-design groups and this whole Indigenous Voice to Parliament exercise, and have been on it since probably October 2019 or thereabouts when we first kicked it off. And we're in the home stretches now. Can I begin by recognising that we're here in Canberra on Ngunnawal country and pay respects to elders past and present, and also to recognise our youth who will be our future leaders and the custodians of our stories, our cultures, our languages and our histories. And, you know, we like to emphasise our youth because they will be the ones who will be the probably key drivers in the voice into the future. And what we wanted to do was to really present to you just the whole notion that this is something new, that there is nothing at the moment, no single body who does have an influence on government across the board. I must say that the Close the Gap Steering Committee has been one of those bodies who's had a great influence over time and can speak with a collective voice. And it's some of the learnings we had from actually the Close the Gap Steering Committee that's influenced some of our thinking in the Voice to Parliament, and how we can, if we really want to put our minds to it, work collectively and have an influence. Just by way of background, I come from Darwin, Kungaraka on my mother's side, Image on my father's side, but live in Canberra now, and have been involved in Indigenous affairs for many decades. Not wanting to give my age away, I probably don't look it, but we got that. So what we wanted to do was, we've got about an hour. We'll actually have three videos that we'll show you as we go through, to sort of give a bit of a description about what we're proposing and the work that's been done to date. But overall, I guess there's a couple of things that we should remember, that the Voice to Parliament co-design groups, including the Senior Advisory Group, are non-government. We're a collection of people who were appointed by the Minister, but independently. Marcia and I had a big say with the Minister in determining membership, and what we made it really clear was that we wanted people who had expertise and who weren't coming to represent any one group in this whole deliberation. And over the time, we worked very closely with the National Indigenous Australians Agency, both their staff, and it's been a great relationship. But at the end of the day, the report is coming from the co-design groups and the Senior Advisory Group to government. So it's not a government report. And I think that's an important differentiation at the very outset. Now, we also recognise that, there were 52 members of the co-design groups and the Senior Advisory Group. The majority were Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, but there were a number of non-Indigenous people there, and that was by intent, as was the intent to appoint people who were had not only expertise but a whole range of different views. So we had the very conservative thinkers to those who are more liberal, and a whole bunch in between. And because we didn't want to just create a body where everybody was of the same mind, because that doesn't stretch anybody in this whole process. And so that was the first thing. And the other was that our membership were from the most remotest communities, including the Torres Strait, to urban environments. And so it was a big collection. And of course, I say of course because I know you guys know it, that we went for gender equality throughout, and made sure that we had almost equal representation of males and females on the group. But at the end of the day, well, can I say that 51 of the 52 members all all agreed to the final report that went up, the interim report, I should say, went up in October last year to the government, and that interim report was released to the public by the Minister on the 9th of January, and it was unchanged, which was, really good. And so part of that release was an undertaking to undertake 4 months of consultations, and that included face-to-face meetings, webinars with stakeholder groups like we're doing now, to invitations for people to put in written submissions, or to put in or to complete a survey that's online, and some people chose to do it offline as well. So far we've had close to 2,000 written responses, and I think, Lauren, do you know about 1,000?
Yeah, we've had 951 survey responses.
951 survey responses. So it's been pretty active, and I'd really encourage you to think about going online, if nothing else, but to do the survey. And as far as a written submission, and they close at the end of this month, it doesn't have to be a comprehensive submission. Some people have just picked on an issue and just lent their support or opposition to that issue, and so people can do the same, either as a collective or as individuals in this process. Look, what I might do is just to go on to our first video now, and I should introduce Jamie Fox. Sorry.
Thanks, Tom. That's all right, Tom. Thanks, Tom. Let me firstly acknowledge that I'm coming to you from lands and Ngunnawal people as well, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and acknowledge and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. I think you mentioned our role as the National Indigenous Australians Agency. We've been really supporting you and the other co-design group members. I think you'll do most of the talking today, but I'm happy to answer any questions people might have about government processes and where we'll end up going as well. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. And Jamie's in charge of this from the agency's perspective in seeing this through. But as we all know, that co-design is about the people most affected, in our case, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working with government to come up with a solution or a number of solutions, and that's the process that's happened so far. So are we queued up to go for the? Yeah. We'll go for the first video from Marcia and I, just talking about the process. The voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been a part of this land for over 65,000 years, and yet in Australia's recent history, our voices haven't always been heard when it comes to the creation of laws, policies and services that impact our lives.
In 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart reaffirmed the need for a national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative body. A body that would serve as a voice to Parliament and Government.
A voice to Parliament and Government is important. It provides a way for our representatives to give advice to Government on things that matter to us and affect us.
It gives people from our communities a stronger way to have their say.
Over the last year, 3 groups, made up of mostly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples,
have worked with government to develop proposals on how an Indigenous voice can best work in Australia.
The Indigenous voice would be a way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to share our views with the Parliament and the Government, and to work in partnership.
To have our voices heard on matters that impact us, and to make decisions and improve local services and outcomes together.
The proposed Indigenous voice is made of 2 important parts that would work together: the local and regional voice and the national voice.
A local and regional voice would be a community-designed and led governance structure. They would work in partnership with all levels of government, providing advice on the design and delivery of programs, policies and services for the region. Local and regional voices would be guided by a flexible, principles-based framework. This would allow for different structures in different regions. It would respond to the diverse circumstances of our people and build on existing arrangements that work well.
The National Voice would be a national advisory body made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We're asking you to consider how membership to the body could work.
The National Voice would provide advice to the Parliament and Australian Government on laws, policies and programs.
It would be involved early and throughout the development of processes, ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives are considered before decisions are made. It's now up to you. We want to hear your feedback on how the proposals would best work for you and for your community.
An Indigenous voice is a step towards lasting change for our future and for the future of our young people. Make sure to have your say and have your voice heard.
Okay, so that's just an overall description of what we're on about and why we're on about it. Just by way of, we want to make this as interactive as we can. So if anybody wants to have a say, if you just, maybe unmute or come on to video, then we'll be able to see you. Unmuting is probably the easiest we can see, and then we can respond to questions. And hopefully it works. But, give a shout out if we don't see you all, because there's probably more people than are on our screen, although we're monitoring. We're monitoring as best we can. So, look, we've got this. We know we need a process, and why do we know that? Well, way back, and look, the full report, interim report, I would really urge you to have a look at if you haven't done so, and that's on the website, and that gives you also a good description of all the a bio for each of the members of the co-design groups and the senior advisory groups. But also there's a wealth of information there about all the entities that led up to where we're at now. And so it's a really good historical overview. Of course, we probably missed some, but we picked on the major ones and gave a little synopsis about what they, how effective they were, etc. And that sort of leads up to why we're at here. There's also an environmental scan, which is probably more relevant when we get down to talking about the local and regional structure, but that's another 20 or so pages, which gives you an idea of how complex this environment is, but also that there's no one body, that represents all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are able to influence public policy. Now, just very, very quickly through the background, you remember way back in 2008, after the Close the Gap campaign kicked off, I did a report as Social Justice Commissioner about a voice, and that led to the, after some deliberation, to the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. We also had Julia Gillard establish the National Expert Panel, and some members might have been on that, but Pat Dodson and Mark Liebler led that, and they looked at constitutional reform. That report then led into, and I guess that's the first big issue too, because that looked at recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution, and which is and a whole lot of other reforms to the Constitution. But I guess that was the first one, and that still is a point that hasn't been finalised yet, and government's been playing around to develop a question and work out what might go to a referendum at a future time. And I emphasise that because sometimes you'll see in media reports the Prime Minister says it's not going to go to referendum yet, or it's not going to go. He's often talking about the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not about the voice. And so that's the first point. I guess then there was a joint select committee which led into the Referendum Council, which led to the Indigenous dialogues that manifested in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We know that the three key issues there were about Makarrata or treaty making, truth telling, and a voice to Parliament. And that's a key issue there. But I guess the point that they're making from the Uluru Group is that it should go to a referendum first, get people to endorse the voice, and then create the voice. And we considered that, as did a joint select committee, parliamentary select committee that was headed up by Pat Dodson, now Senator Pat Dodson, and representing Labor, and Julian Lesser representing the Conservatives, and all the other minor parties and a number of independents were also on that joint select committee. And they considered the Uluru Statement from the Heart and other submissions, and people like the 5 social justice commissioners, there were 5 at the time, they all agreed to, well, we put in a submission, and as did many others. Anyhow, long story short, the Joint Select Committee considered all of those, and they presented a majority report, and that majority report is significant because it was agreed to by both houses, and they only made 4 recommendations, and it's the first 2 that are relevant to us. The first recommendation was that the government should, within their current term of Parliament, establish a co-design process to come up with a number of models to present to government to consider for a voice to Parliament. And that's what our exercise is all about, is coming up with a number of options for government to consider, and you would have seen that in the interim report. Recommendation 2 was that on receiving the report, the government would then consider implementation of the voice to Parliament. Actually, as a voice to government, we extended it to voice to Parliament, and they would consider whether it's created by legislation, by referendum, or other means. Could be a commission, could be a company limited by guarantee. So that's the second stage or the second recommendation, which is follows on from what we're doing. And that's why, people say, oh, well, you're not considering, a voice to go into the Constitution. Well, it's not our role to do that. We're only responding to recommendation 1. And the other 2 recommendations are about truth telling and those, but that's even outside of our brief.
So, Tom, I think Chris Burke's put his hand up on the Zoom.
Oh, okay.
Was it Chris?
Oh, yeah, Chris Burke, yep.
Yeah.
G'day, Tom. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Chris.
An advisory body to Parliament or the government is not what we were talking about at Uluru. In fact, that was particularly what we didn't want. What we wanted was a voice to the Parliament, which would hold the Parliament accountable for what they were doing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So heading down the advisory path when we've already got a plethora of advisory bodies on everything across the entire service spectrum across the country seems to be a retrograde step and a significant step away from what we talked about at Uluru.
Yeah,
What I would suggest you ought to consider as a model for the governance of a voice is as a parliamentary committee. If you think of the voice as a parliamentary committee, which has the power and the resources to undertake inquiries, to deliver reports into the Parliament, that is closer to the idea of what we were talking about at Uluru, rather than an advisory body which makes recommendations to government or inquires into things on government's behest or deals and negotiates with bureaucrats. This is a significant step back from what we talked about at Uluru, which is really to have a voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people directly in the Parliament. Personally, I'd have preferred to have seen reserved seats in the Parliament, either in the Senate or the Reps or both. However, that wasn't what people wanted to talk about at Uluru, but at least that level of power and accountability which something like a parliamentary committee could deliver.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Firstly, first comment is that we're not responding to Ullaru's statement from the heart. The Joint Parliamentary Committee did that, and we're responding to their recommendation, which came out, as a majority report, and that was to establish some models on a voice to government, and we've extended the voice to Parliament. A couple of things on an advisory voice. The people have suggested why you go to an advisory voice and we want to have a bigger say. Well, the fact is that the Parliament is a sovereign entity. Nobody can overturn or influence what the Parliament does. Be it the Queen, the Governor General, the High Court. They can't even do it. So we've got no hope of doing it as a member of the population. And so it is only an advisory group to the Parliament. To the government, and why the government? Well, that's what the recommendation one was about, and why the Parliament? Well, it's the two different roles that both of them have that I think needs to be really understood, and that is if it comes to legislation and major discussion, that's the Parliament. If it comes to the everyday business of funding of funding distributions and working with bureaucracy and controlling bureaucracy, that belongs to the government. That's their responsibility, irrespective of who it is, and they handle it. So I think it's important, and we discuss this at length. Important that we do consider both. We also reflected on, really the only one significant report that goes to the Parliament is the Social Justice Commissioner reports, and they go in every year, and those reports, thank you, go into the black hole of Parliament, and that's the end of it. And there's no end of parliamentary committee reports, be they House of Reps, Senate, Joint Committee reports, that all get done and never see the light of day. You get royal commissions that do reports to parliaments, never get to know what's happening with recommendations. And so, I hear what you're saying about a parliamentary committee, and I wrote about it in 2008 as a way to go, and there's nothing stopping it. And that's potentially, we'll get down to the national voice, and that's going to be potentially a way forward, and we talk about that in the report. But that's just a little ahead of where we're at. So that was what we had to consider. We also, even though it wasn't in our mandate, to consider making a recommendation on a referendum or whatever. But what we have undertaken to do is all the submissions that we've received, and quite a number of them all saying that it should be constitutionally enshrined, and we'll report on the numbers that have said that, and we'll do justice to those. What's interesting is that there's very few reports that talk about sequencing, and this is what Marcia and I talk about a lot, as a sequencing, and whether you go to legislation first and then go on to a referendum down the track, or whether you go to a referendum first and hope for the best, and then it gets going. And in our deliberations across the groups, we were very minded of the 1999 referendum on Australia becoming a republic, and that in the lead up to that, there was a lot of confidence that that would get up. But as always, the government is obliged to fund a no vote, and the confusion that was created at that referendum, including by the no voters. And the thing about a no vote, you don't have to have facts. All you got to do is create enough, uncertainty out there, and the history of referendum shows that if people aren't confident, if they don't have the total support of both governments, then they won't get up. And that's what happened 21 years ago, and we still it hasn't resurrected itself as a referendum on a republic. And we believe that wouldn't be the best way to go, to take a chance on this, because of a couple of things. One is, and I think the key things, One is we had the Joint Select Committee report, which was bipartisan, and there was no minority report, which was important. The second one was that we had Ken Wyatt as the first Indigenous person holding the portfolio of Indigenous affairs, and that his I guess, influence or status within both the Conservative government and the Parliament was pretty positive. And we had the Prime Minister who's expressed an interest in supporting this, and there's not a great deal of opposition that's publicly demonstrated, amongst politicians of all colours up there, including the independents. And Marcia and I have done a number of tours of Parliament House talking to people. So the options were. If we decide we want to, if the government decides to go to referendum, that's still 4 or 5 years off. And Chris, the other one thing you said was that yes, there are many bodies out there who are having a say, including the Coalition of Peaks, and the Close the Gap Steering Committee, we can't forget, and the National Health Leadership Forum, etc. But most of them are still single issue advocates, be it land rights, health, education, etc. Although there is this increased interest in social and cultural determinants that we're pushing through the health plan, and governments across the border are looking at that, and the Coalition of Peaks are doing a great job on the closing the gap targets, but they represent membership of organisations, whereas our interest was all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The very high percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who aren't members of organisations also needed to be able to have a voice, and so that's where we came from in our deliberations in creating that sort of environment to do that. So yeah, that's where we're at. You'll see in the report, the interim report, that we came up with basically a number of frameworks that we could follow. We were very clear that none of it was set in stone, that there would not be a one-size-fits-all across the nation, that we'd built in flexibility and an ability for the organisations to grow over time, and that's I guess that's where we're at. And that was I guess we got a little bit of a bit of confidence when the government didn't change anything in the interim report before they publicly released it. Not to say that won't happen, but at this stage it seems pretty positive. So there's more positives about going along the route that we're proposing than there are negatives from what we can see. So are there any other questions? Otherwise, or comments? Happy to take either or. We're about halfway through the allotted time here. So look, what we might do is go on to our second lot of videos, and that's about the local and regional voice structure. What we wanted to do was to be able to get the views of the grassroots influencing public policy. And so in that deliberation, we recognised that it was very difficult to do without a local and regional structure. But we also recognise very clearly that that even though the Commonwealth has a big role and a lot of money might emanate from the Commonwealth, a lot of the activity happens at the grassroots or at the local and regional level, and that is the role of the state government in all the frontline workers and the local government. And so during this whole process of co-design, there was another group that sat outside of that, but also met, and Jamie led that group from the Commonwealth, and that's a group called the Senior Advisory, the Senior Officials Group, and that comprised of all the most senior Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander officials from each state and territory government, as well as the local government association representatives from there, and they just sort of we kept them informed about our developments, and it was mainly to see whether they had any sort of negative response to what we were proposing. End of the day, it was, they didn't, and recognising they're officials, not politicians, and they've got to get it through through the political side of things. But there seems to be not a opposition to what we're proposing, and we're also gained some confidence in that we've, as you mentioned, have got the national cabinet where the pollies, the most senior officials, first ministers, are all talking about Indigenous affairs and closing the gap, and so the targets, and with the new agreement coming out, when that comes out, what sort of role they have, I'm not sure. I'm not party to that, but we'll see how that rolls out. But as you'll see in this set of videos, that we're not advocating that anything should change to existing arrangements. So we'll hit over to that video. Thanks.
A local and regional voice would be a governance structure at the regional level. It would be designed and led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities in each region. This will be guided by the proposed principles-based framework. Each local and regional voice would provide advice to all levels of government. This includes the Australian government, state or territory governments, and local governments. Advice from a local and regional voice would be on what's important to communities across its region. Local and regional voices could also work in partnership with all levels of government on how to improve local services and deliver on community priorities. This approach is sometimes referred to as shared decision-making. A key role for each local and regional voice would be ongoing engagement with local communities, groups, organisations and other stakeholders across their region. This will ensure its work reflects the views, priorities and aspirations of local people. Local and regional voices would also provide advice to the national voice on national issues. They would not manage government programs or funding, nor replace or undermine existing bodies. No one set structure is proposed for local and regional voices. Different regions could design different local and regional voice governance structures, depending on what works best for them, guided by the framework. Traditional owners living on country, as well as all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents in a region, would be able to be involved.
You only saw one of the videos, and there's actually 4 of them in this sequence that we're all supposed to be all put together. But look, what it essentially said, and we'll try and get that uploaded to show, but in essence, what it said is that there needs to be joint decision making. There needs to be a structure that we can talk together. There needs to be a whole range of regions, and we're proposing between 25 and 35 regions across Australia, and to see how they operate. But we left it up to the consultations to guide us as to how many regions there should be. In the whole process, we looked at 2 really. We looked at a whole range of things. As I said, that environmental scan shows, quite a number of the existing arrangements that are out in states. Some are more mature than others, and for example, the Torres Strait Regional Authority we saw as a very good descriptor of what could be achieved, where the Torres Strait Islander peoples work with the local government, the Queensland government and the Commonwealth government to determine the priorities and funding distributions, within the Torres Strait. And so it's a very effective body. And they also lobby directly with each of the respective governments to affect change that impacts on them. Now, it's not all good, and doesn't mean they stop lobbying, but, they've been trying to look at climate change mitigation programs. Haven't been all that successful in those. There's been a few little efforts. So basically what it's saying is really that there is an arrangement there. We also looked at the ACT elected body, and as an example, where in the ACT public elections nominate 8 or 9 people. They then work with the ACT government to look at priorities and some influence of funding in those areas. That has mixed successes as well, but the key issue about that is that after all their meetings, an account of what went on is put up publicly, and it's on the on their website, and you can see, it's a transparent process. Still a long way to go, and but at least that's a sort of model. We looked at the shared decision-making model that exists in New South Wales. Works much better in some areas than others, and we looked at for example the Redfern Laperouse group and their empowered communities, which seems to have have a fair bit of success so far, and really organising amongst themselves. And there's about 8 or 9 of those around the nation as well, the empowered communities, with varying degrees of success on those, but it's at least empowering our mob to do a bit more. And one of the things we did do, and you'll see this in a video a bit later, and it's just really it gave a little flash to that, and that is we talked about principles, and that guided the way that we saw the local and regional level, and there's nine principles, and they're worth looking at, but they're anything from community led to empowerment to transparency and accountability measures, but overall it's about how we can work together in a collective way, and I reflected in these to the rest of the group about how in the Closing the Gap campaign, when we established it, we all spoke with one voice when it came to issues around closing the gap, but that didn't stop each of the members individually advocating for their area of interest. But we could work together, and have demonstrated since 2006 that can happen. So it's a great model to look at, and that influenced some of our thinking, and also some of the thinking around the National Congress in the way that was established and became reflective of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's views, and it more so in both of them, things like the Ethics Council. But look, that's it's unfortunate that we don't have all the videos, but the videos are online.
Yeah. Coming now, apparently.
They're coming up in a minute, yeah.
So I might just pick up, Paul Wright had asked a question, I don't know if everyone can see it, about how does the voice speak to and hold state and territory governments to account, and thinking about the regional voice model. And I think you were just articulating how that worked. Paul and colleagues, that's one of the reasons that I'm engaging with my counterparts from all the state and territory governments, because we want to make sure that when the local and regional voice is set up, that it has a pathway through to a national body, should the government accept that, but also it could exist in its own right to influence things at the local level. The Prime Minister has spoken a number of times about the importance of local level efforts and voices being heard. So that's one of the reasons that's been a focus of the report that went to the government. But certainly I'm speaking to the states, and Tom mentioned, and Chris has also mentioned, the ACT elected body. That's certainly an example that's in the interim report, and some other models that are along those lines. We've also been speaking to Victoria about their First Nations Assembly, for example, which is also looking at expanding its remit beyond its current focus as well. So I can't answer Paul's question directly to say, yes, of course it'll do it in this way, but it's certainly an issue that has been part of the conversation and why I'm talking to the states and territories
Yes,
as well.
yeah, thanks. And Minister White also has undertaken to talk to his counterparts about, and I believe he's already spoken to some of them as we've gone along, and to get them across it. And of course, there's the bigger, higher level discussions on the national agreement through the National Cabinet. That's giving us a bit more exposure to that. But in the report, we've also said that at the end of the day, once Commonwealth has made a determination, and if it goes by legislation, there should be, the states and territories should also consider having like legislations to empower this group. But as I said, so far there hasn't been any major sort of kickback from the states on the directions we're taking. And and picking up Chris's and Paul's views and somebody else's up there. A lot of this was in the 2008 report, and yes, you can have, and I'll pick up on this when we get to the national voice, because we're only talking about the local and regional at the moment. And some of those become more relevant and achievable at that level. But it's not to say that we're not able to give an influence now at the local level. But there's and we've had it expressed to us as well from land councils and the people who have to travel in from all over Australia, try and lobby individual ministers and they waste a lot of time and money and the outcome is very limited. And so unless we get a single voice, then it's going to be really challenging. I believe we now have the videos up and ready to go, so we might just show them.
An important part of design of local and regional voices would be the number of regions and how their location will be decided. Between 25 and 35 local and regional voice regions across Australia are proposed. Feedback from consultations will help the co-design groups form a final recommendation to the Australian Government on the specific number of regions. This will include the recommendation on how many regions nationally and how many regions this could mean in each state and territory. No specific regions or boundaries have been proposed in the interim report. If the government supports the final proposal, there will be further discussions to help decide the details of regional areas and boundaries. These would be between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and all levels of government. Under the proposal, existing regional arrangements would be considered as a starting point in these discussions. Cultural groupings would also be a key factor. Population and geography size would also be considered. Regions could be aligned to state and territories' borders, unless there is a strong reason why this would not work.
Local and regional voices would be underpinned by a principles-based framework which would need to be met. This would be a governance structure at the regional level, and the principles-based framework would apply to all regions. This framework would give communities and regions flexibility to design their own structures. It responds to the diversity, history and culture of each region across the country. The framework is also intended to enable communities to build on existing and different arrangements that are working well. This approach would allow arrangements to evolve and adapt over time. The proposed framework includes 9 principles: empowerment, inclusive participation, cultural leadership, community-led design, non-duplication and links to existing bodies, respectful long-term partnerships, transparency and accountability, capability-driven, data and evidence-based decision-making. The principles would also guide the partnership arrangements between voices and governments. The framework aims to give local people and communities a genuine say on matters that are important to them and support true partnership with governments. Formal recognition of local and regional voices would be based on minimum expectations drawn from 3 principles that relate to good governance. These are inclusive participation, cultural leadership, transparency and accountability. Local and regional voices could be recognised by either a joint assessment with governments or via an independent assessment.
Each region's pathway to setting up their local and regional voice would be different. This would depend on what arrangements already exist in the region to bring people together. Some local and regional voices would be adapted from existing arrangements. Some local and regional voices would be designed as new structures. Communities in the region could agree to use existing arrangements as their local and regional voice, some with only a few changes. They may also agree to adapt, enhance, or change their existing arrangements as needed. Communities may also decide to design completely new arrangements. The aspirations, strengths, culture, and history of the communities would guide the design. Communities may agree to set up a transitional group to design these new arrangements. Transitional groups would work together with communities and stakeholders to set up their local and regional voice. All arrangements would need to meet the minimum expectations for local and regional voices.
Okay, so I've picked up on some of those matters as well. So we might just go straight into if there's any questions about the local and regional or comments. Yeah. Okay. So we'll given there's no real issues, that people have come forward with. I guess the key things is that this process, is principles guided, and we think that, and already, in the consultations we've had, many of our responses have been very positive, and they believe those principles are ones that they could adopt in their own organisations. You might recall on the website, if you've been onto the website, that after each of the consultations, we actually put up a little summary of the key points, and they'll happen 2 or 3 days after. So you can go onto the website and look at what other people have said during our community consultations, where people have agreed to. You can also see, what the submissions have been saying, and some of them are very comprehensive, others are very basic. So all the information you'll need is up there on the website. I guess the other that we picked up in consultations about local and regional, and then, it's no surprise to people that in many areas there's still a lot of needing for a lot of healing within organisations and amongst organisations. And so we're not saying that this is going to all be honky-dory from day one, because, when it comes to expanding regional boundaries, being more inclusive, some agree totally, others are totally opposed to it. But there's a limit to the number of regions that we'll have. What we have proposed, and we didn't talk in detail in the report about funding and funding support in the future, but we have made it really clear that this is not going to be a cheap exercise, because once we land on the number of regions, each of those regions would be, we'd suggest would have a secretariat to support the getting information about the region together, helping to facilitate discussions, and then also looking at how each of the regions would nominate a couple of members to then be the group that lobbies with government. So all of that requires a bit of effort and support. So we have to look at that. Again, you might recall existing bodies won't be affected. This is the key thing that we learned from ATSIC. The lesson we learned from ATSIC is that this body would not control funding or manage any money or programs. It's an advocacy lobby group, and it's a partnership group with government so that we can get into shared decision making, and that's the key to this success. I think will be that. We also said that bodies like the Torres Strait Regional Authority, the Assembly in Victoria, once that's matured, because a lot of these things haven't really developed up yet, or the ACT elected body, if those jurisdictions determine it, that could be their regional voice, or have a big say in that.
Saying national videos ready to go, Tom.
Oh yeah. So so that's where we're at with that. But come back a bit later if you want to. Look, we might just go on to the national voice now, and we've got a bit of flexibility. We can go over 10 to 15 minutes if you guys are willing to hang around. But yeah, let's look at the national one.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would choose the members of the National Voice. All states and the Northern Territory would be represented by 2 National Voice members. The ACT would be represented by 1 or 2 members. The Torres Strait Islands would also be represented by 1 or 2 members. There would be instances where the members from the Torres Strait Islands represent the views of all Torres Strait Islanders, including those living on the mainland. This would occur for matters of national significance to Torres Strait Islanders. There are 2 ways members could be chosen. Model 1 is by choosing members from local and regional voices. Model 2 is by choosing members through an election process. Under both models, there would be gender balance among members. Under both models, there is also an option for a state or territory representative body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to select National Voice members if one exists. The National Voice could have up to 20 members. This could include 2 appointed members to fill gaps where needed, but only where the National Voice members and minister agree. For example, appointees could be used to ensure a mix of urban, regional, and remote members. Membership would be open to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There could be an ethics council to provide advice to the National Voice on governance matters and ongoing integrity. 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are under 25 years of age, and 25% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live with a disability. Permanent youth and disability advisory groups would ensure those perspectives are captured by the National Voice.
The proposed National Voice would be an advisory body to both the Australian Parliament and the Australian Government. It could provide advice on national matters it decides are the most important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. These matters would be prioritised by the National Voice. They would be on nationally significant matters of critical importance to the social, spiritual and economic well-being of or which has a significant or particular impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The national voice could be engaged from the early stages of the development of relevant laws and policies. It could provide both formal and informal advice. Parliament and the government would be required to ask the national voice for advice on laws and policies which only impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They would be expected to ask the national voice for advice on laws and policies that have a big impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. When a law is introduced to Parliament, it would be made clear if the national voice has been asked for advice, if advice was provided, and what the advice is. The national voice would add to what exists already. This means it would work with and talk to existing structures, not replace them. The national voice would also connect with local and regional voices, ensuring it reaches into local communities. This would be a two-way relationship. The national voice would seek community input through local and regional voices. These elements support the role of the national voice to have the right and responsibility on behalf of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to advise Parliament and the government on national issues that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Carl's had to run off as well.
Yep. Okay, thanks for that. Look, just a quick response. A couple of people have had to go, so not to worry. But for those that are still here, I think as Paulo asked, how do you keep states and territory governments accountable, going back to the local and regional? I guess there's a couple of things. One is that you might have seen that there is a growing move for state and territory governments to report back annually on how they've gone for achieving the closing the gap targets, similar to what the federal parliament's doing, and that's one way. The federal government's also asked the Productivity Commission to report back every couple of years, I think it is, on the progress on the targets. That may or may not be extended down to the local, to state and territory jurisdictions. But it's that type of accountability. And as I said earlier, that if there is going to be national legislation, then complementary legislation in the states would also give some sort of guidance. And of course, the way that they've gone about it with the ACT in having these regular meetings and feedback sessions helps to keep them focused. But I guess, overall, when it comes to the federal level, they're a sovereign entity. And so you can only try and influence rather than direct. Now, on that video, I guess one of the things is there was talk about two models, an elected model or an appointed model. As we've gone around, some of the people, as you'd appreciate, didn't necessarily trust either of those models to get the right sort of people up. And so there was a third emerging model, and that's what was done for the National Congress, where expressions of interest in the Congress's terms, national expressions of interest for people who wanted to attend the Adelaide meeting, the 100 people, over 350 applications. They were all assessed and 100 people determined it. We were just in Tasmania last week, and, they also through the other dimension, well, who in Tasmania would make the decision? And so I drew on what's happening in Victoria at the moment, where their new commission that they're establishing has to look at the impacts of colonisation, has 3 commissioners from Victoria, but 2 from outside of Victoria could be appointed. So there's an emerging development where external people are getting involved in jurisdictional issues, and that sort of can be extended by establishing, within a region call for expressions of interest, which allows everybody, including those who are not members of organisations, because that was a concern. Okay, if the organisations, they'll only be promoting their own people potentially, not all those other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who aren't members of organisations. The expression of interest would allow that to happen, and you could get people like, former commissioners, and we've got plenty of commissioners around now, and former commissioners who could be independent to this process. You've got 2 Indigenous Royal Commissioners in Helen Milroy and Mick Gooder, who are eminent people who could participate if they wanted to in this sort of process. So that's a third model that's being proposed. Picking up on what Chris Burkett said earlier, yes, what we're proposing, and at the parliamentary level, is something that's going to be akin to the 2 bodies that exist at the moment. For any new legislation that comes through, the bill that comes through has to go through the Bill Scrutiny Committee and the Human Rights Committee before it's considered. Theoretically, it doesn't always happen in a timely manner, but we're proposing that a third parliamentary committee be established, and that is an Indigenous parliamentary committee. So any proposed legislation goes through that body, and that body could comprise of both politicians and non-politicians. And that's, as Chris said, can work. But that's just been the proposal. And as I said, it wasn't balked at in when we put in our interim report. So, that's got some potential. But, what we suggested, that the voice would be both reactive. If Parliament asked the voice for some advice, we'd provide it after going through a whole lot of, process to be able to get a considered voice, or we could take matters up to government or to the Parliament or to the government as we see fit. But also, I think the voice would be a body that would work with bureaucrats even before legislation is developed, or in that original formative period, as well as provide advice on programs and services and have that interaction. It doesn't exist now, and that's what we need to do. And what we also need to do is to impact on that 80% of the funding that's non-Indigenous specific, that's handled by all the other portfolios who've got it off pretty easy so far, and in not being accountable as much as the Indigenous elements of governments are. So we're trying to capture a whole lot in that, but it's well worth having a little read of that. And of course, with these videos in your own time, they're on the website, so just have another look at them, because it often takes more than one hit to grasp what's in there. So, anything, Jamie?
No, just the only thing I was going to say, Tom, is you've mentioned that we're going around talking to people around the country. There's face-to-face consultations happening now. Formal written submissions still welcome till the end of the month, end of April, and do the survey. And then you and your colleagues will get together and provide the next report to the government, hopefully mid-year, and then hopefully the government will respond quickly.
And because the whole idea is to try and get it in the process so that they can make a decision whilst we currently have a government and or the current government. And but even if there's a change of government, Labor hasn't expressed any opposition to any of what's being proposed so far. So, but we'll see. Still a way to go. I guess the key thing is that our role is to provide some models. Government's role is to consider how they'll be implemented, and that'll happen hopefully within this term of Parliament. The other really important thing that is that each of the jurisdictions will be nominating 2 people, and even though we said 1 to 2 people from ACT and the Torres Straits, the reality is that if we want to get gender equality, it's 2 people, and that's been sort of expressed to us as well as we've gone around. And so assuming we've got all of those people, And even though they're coming from a jurisdiction, once they become the national voice, they are totally independent. They're not there to represent what their state or organisation or tribal group wants. They're there to think about the big issues that nationally applicable to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that's part of the principles. And look, you know, people have been very keen on that, as have been, you know, after we've had a chat, you know, support for the Ethics Council, and you know, there's been often the view said that, you know, wouldn't it be nice if the Parliament adopted an Ethics Council, and you know, that's at state and territory and also national level. But anyhow, we can't make them do that, but you never know, it might flow on. So any questions or comments? Well, Christy Lee, were you wanting to make a comment, or you just wanted to show us your face? You just appeared as a video, so that was all good. Good to see you. Now, you know, if you got those comments, get them in if you want to put in a written submission. But the real issue is to have a look at the survey that's online and make sure your colleagues and family also have a look at it. It's only got a half a dozen questions, and they go to some of the key issues for each of the levels, the co-design groups, and then that will give us a bit more direction, because we want to seriously take into account the feedback that we received in designing the final report. We expect that the final report will be, we'll have done our bit by early July. It's stretched a little bit because of, you know, we're supposed to be up at Karratha and up Geraldton, all these places, but, you know, they've all had to be cancelled because of the cyclone last week. You know, another community we've had to delay because of, you know, a death in the community. So it's, you know, there's a fair bit, but we'll get a report on. But our report is not the final process. Even when government makes a decision, we then move into another co-design process to work out how the specifics will operate region by region, because as we wanted to make it really clear that we're not proposing a one size fits all, and it needs to work for us, and we've got to think about how do we want to operate into the future, not just in here and now. And, you know, one of the things that people have said, well, how do we include those people who are not involved in an organisation in this whole process? Well, you can do it many different ways, and people reflected on the NAC days and NACC days when they used to have town hall meetings. Well, we don't necessarily have to have town hall meetings now, but we can have, you know, virtual meetings. And we heard many times around the nation how virtual meetings are working, and, you know, that includes people in the remotest areas. You know, Jamie was
this one.
Yeah, well, this one here, but you know, even in the community, and Jamie was in the APY lands, and what, 140 people?
Yeah, I didn't go to that one, but yeah, but at Pukajar, 140 people came along, which was great. It was brilliant.
Yeah, biggest attendance so far, you know, to talk about these issues. So there is a, you know, there is an interest out there. Yeah. All right. Well, look, thank you all for your participation. I know we're a little bit over time, but you know, don't hesitate to give us a call, and if we need to explain anything else. Right. But thanks, Joe, for organising.
See you all.
And we'll sign off.